Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Bevington Group webinar. I'm Roger Perry, CEO of the Bevington Group, and I'll be your host and presenter this morning for a short 45 minutes presentation on what I think is a very important subject at this point in time, and I'll explain why shortly. But before we start, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the lands from which I'm presenting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so on to the subject du jour, which is decision-making, risk, and radical uncertainty. And buried in this, there'll be a concept of fragility, which I'll explain shortly, but it's very relevant for your decision-making, particularly at this point in time. If you do have questions, you can send them to webinar@bevingtongroup.com. Whilst theoretically I can pick up on the Q&A screen, we often run out of time before we get to questions because the Bevington presentations do tend to be quite content rich, which I understand from the feedback we get is quite appropriate. The webinar materials itself will pop up on the Bevington website afterwards, so you don't need to take copious notes. There is a little bit of difference between what we post and what we say, of course, but there will be materials available. Okay, but listening in is important because the talk around it is, particularly in this subject, very important. Okay, we're going to talk about today's context. So why is this subject important for now? I'm going to talk about fragility in organizations and how does that affect your decision-making. Then definitions, certainties, risks, and uncertainties, they're not the same things. Concepts for navigating radical uncertainty, and then operationalizing anti-fragility, which is a concept which will help you with your decision-making and in fact with your operating model overall. This is actually the first of two presentations on decision-making because we just found we just couldn't address this subject even in a very, very shallow way in just 45 minutes. So this will be one of two. Okay, so today's context. I'm actually going to start this by talking about basically a case study. And the picture on the bottom left-hand corner of this is a mayor of a Japanese village, or he was, from 1945 to 1987, of Fudai in Japan. And the story here is this mayor basically was concerned about tsunami events because there had been two tsunami events, one in 1896 and one in 1933. And they were big tsunamis, and he was worried about one happening again. So he actually decided to try and convince the village to build an enormous dam, or enormous for them, to protect the village. Now, this is not a very large town or anything. This is actually a village. So this is a very, very big engineering undertaking, but he faced a lot of resistance because it was unknowable when, or even if, many argued, another tsunami would arise. And we're going to come back to this case study at the end to think about decision-making under uncertainty and some of the costs you have to bear. And we'll come to the end after we've gone through some of the principles. So bear that in mind. So in today's context, I'm not going to talk about this a lot because there are other places I have done, but you all know we still have inflation. We still have historically high interest rates. We still have decreased productivity, and up until recently, certainly still relatively poor consumer sentiment. And we certainly have a per capita recession, even though we haven't had an overall economy recession. So these are times which create a great deal of uncertainty, and they have other attributes as well, which I'll come to. One of the attributes that we're going to talk about is fragility, and Australia has enormous robustness, but it's also got some fragility, and that's in its concentration of industries. And this is a Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity map, so it's from Harvard. And what it's saying is that over time, Australia has effectively become less complex. And that basically means fewer industries. So fragility in organizations. This is an important first concept. Now, because it will basically have an impact on how you make decisions. So the current economic situation would imply that some organizations are fragile. And that means faced with economic challenges, they've actually gone into negative profit. And basically, this is the percentage growth in organizations' profits. And as you can see, as we've hit economic rocks, we've basically got an increasing number of companies that have got themselves into trouble. But what do we really mean by fragility? So there's a philosopher called Taleb, and Taleb wrote the book Black Swan. He also wrote about anti-fragility and fragility as concepts. And fragility really is when systems appear stable, and think of an organization as a system, but actually they're vulnerable. Now, fragility is another way to think about risks, in effect. So a risk is a specific event that might happen that would lead to a problem, and you might try to reduce the probability or reduce the impact of that particular risk. But rather than thinking about it that way, another way to think about it is that some parts of the organizations are fragile, and there are a whole bunch of risks that can emerge that will result in that particular link breaking. And fragility is an important way to think about risk because it's a flip side to it. And sometimes it's hard to predict exactly what can happen. A few people predicted the GFC, and although a handful of people did do so, it was so small, it was just hardly a blip. Same with the pandemic. Some people theorized it was possible, but no one really was prepared. So systems do often exhibit signs of vulnerability. They can be hidden. It can basically lead to an inability to adapt in some cases. And some contexts create more fragility. So size has benefits, but it's also got disbenefits because often they're less adaptable, large organizations. Complexity, which is not understood, can lead to fragility, and concentration risks, for example, a single point of failure can lead to fragility. Now, some of the fragilities are actually in the way decisions are made, and we're going to come to that in a few minutes' time. But fragility is an important concept. So it's a risk-related concept, and of course, some of this is decision-making, risk, and uncertainty, so it's important to know this. What Taleb said about fragility is it can be driven by a range of factors, and he focused on size, complexity, and concentration. And really, to give you a bit more of a sense of this, large organizations often resist change. And I think if you've been in them, you know that's the case. It can be very, very difficult to turn the ship. When situation changes, when context changes, and we know it's not just economic context, we've got enormous geopolitical changes happening at the moment, then that can be a problem because you can find yourself in the wrong swim lane, in effect. Large organizations sometimes centralize decision-making into single points of failure, or centralize resources or critical activities into single points of failure. This can also be a risk. If your supply chain comes from one country and that link is broken, for example, that's a risk. And in fact, some of the activity to spread the supply chain risk across multiple geographies is as a consequence of this form of concentration risk. Now, I'm not going to go through everything, but I will say larger systems can be opaque. And in larger systems, sometimes management mistake complicated models for true understanding. Of course, the opposite happens as well. Some people can oversimplify. You've got to watch for single points of failures and basically an efficiency focus. And we love efficiency. It's our day-to-day job in many senses. You don't want to overdo it so that you've got no redundancy. And we'll talk about redundancy in a few minutes' time, particularly when you're making very large decisions. So these are items to watch. It's a handy checklist to have when you're thinking about fragility, because fragilities can be organization-wide, but they often appear at certain points of the organization. They're often at concentration points. Not always, but often at concentration points. So it's a flip side of risk, and it's an excellent concept. So for Taleb, fragility was in a continuum. So you're not yes, no. It's not binary. It's a continuum. So if you look at this example, you might have a narrow product offer, but a long lead time to change it. Well, if the circumstances change and that product's no longer fit for purpose, a long lead time to change it might leave you exposed. Now, robust, that's fragile. Robust is impervious to uncertainty, and this is a broad and diverse offer, and long lead times, but you've got other offers that you can fall back on. Now, anti-fragile is the opposite of fragile. And essentially, anti-fragile is a situation where actually stressors to the system make you stronger. So I've talked about this in some of the resilience webinars that we've done, is that stress unrest for humans or for systems can actually lead to strengthening of the system, and that can occur here. And this is an organization, for example, with a narrow product offer, but a very short lead time, so it can adapt very, very quickly. So that ability to adapt is a feature of anti-fragility. So that feature to adapt will actually affect your decision making, because if you have a slow adaptation profile, that's going to affect your risk profile in effect, and it's going to affect the way you make decisions. So more on that later, but these are important concepts. So fragility is a great way to think about your organization, and look for fragilities in your organization is an important thing to do. And it can absolutely affect your strategy. You might want to be reducing those fragilities. Now, Anthea Roberts, and you can look up her website, anthearoberts.com, is an ANU professor. So here in Australia, and she's also been launching some very interesting AI, something called Dragonfly, and it's worthwhile looking Anthea up. So Anthea has been publishing on a 3 R's model, which is risk, reward, and resilience. And think of resilience as a stepping stone. That's the way I think of it, towards anti-fragility. So resilience means you can recover. Anti-fragility means you actually get stronger because of the risks and challenges and even failures that you make. So Anthea talks about resilience having a number of lenses, or you can take a number of lenses to resilience. You can think about your absorptive capability. So you've got reserves, you can take the hit, and that buys you time to adapt. There's adaptive capability, which you can respond to changes by making adjustments in your processes or your products or your people or your structures, so you can cope with the change in context. Because bear in mind, we're talking about uncertain times. Things might change. And then a transformative capability, which is you can actually really deeply change the system structure and the incentives to move forward. So these are 3 capacities. Now, if we link what Anthea Roberts is doing to Taleb's anti-fragility, in effect, columns 2 and 3, adaptive and transformative, are features of an anti-fragile organization. It's highly adaptive. These will be important when thinking about your risk profile and what risks you take. And they're just very important strategically to know to what extent you actually have some room to move because you can adapt. Okay, so some more concepts on risk and uncertainty before we proceed. Now, given the economic picture I talked about, and given the geopolitical context, and of course they'll overlap, we actually have plenty of uncertainties before us. Will we be able to manage inflation? Will the new US administration impact our trade flows with tariffs? Will we fix our productivity problems? We've exceptionally low productivity growth at the moment, and that's actually inflationary. Will we avoid a recession? Can we build enough housing? Will employment even remain robust and unemployment remain low? Can we escape a per capita recession? And the questions go on. Plenty of debate, plenty of an uncertainty. It's actually difficult to put a number on these, probability that's precise. So what is uncertainty, and why am I even using the word rather than risk? Well, smarter people than me have been distinguishing between risk and uncertainty. And there's a great book called Radical Uncertainty by Kay and King. Howard Marks, the very famous Oak Tree leader, a very famous investor, they talk about uncertainty. And the thing about risk is risk really, in this definition, to these people, really applies to things you can quantify. So think of games of chance, often card games or dice games. You don't know what will happen, but you can actually specify the probabilities because the rules of the game are known, and you can specify those probabilities with some confidence. Whereas in a complex world we face at the moment, we're often faced with unquantifiable risks. We don't know what will happen. We might have a view, and we'll come to taking a view in a few minutes, and we perhaps should have a view, but we should also be aware that we might be wrong and have some backup plans in place. Now we're talking about risk management. Now, those situations where you can't put a probability on it, which quite frankly is most of the situations we face, that's uncertainty. And Kay and King go to some lengths to explain why and how we've really come to confuse the two, assuming that subjective estimates of probability are right, when in fact they may be anything but right. So if you quantify it, really quantify it, it's risk. If you can't, it's uncertainty. And that's really how we think here at Bevington about things. And we sit at the feet of masters on this. There are many great thinkers who've pointed out this difference. And actually have warned of being too certain about the probabilities. And the example most quoted recently is the models in and around the time of the GFC. The models kind of worked when the situation was stable, but then there was a discontinuity. Something happened where the system broke and the probabilities became completely meaningless. So probabilistic systems, those which we rely on with some precision and we're sure that the numbers are right, the probabilities are right, really best suited to games of chance, where we know the rules of the game, and also situations where the underlying system is stable. And therein lies the problem. It's hard to predict probabilities when the underlying system is unstable. And let's think of the world at the moment. There are plenty of instabilities in the world at the moment. So we need to be suspicious about our ability to estimate probabilities. Now, that inability to tell what's going to happen next and have a number of competing hypotheses puts us into that radical uncertainty situation. And then the decision-making context is radical uncertainty and also potentially fragility of the organization. And as a leader, you're sitting in this spot, having to think about it. Actually, as a person, as a family member, you may actually think this way. There are radical uncertainties around you. How do you manage your way through this, given that you might have certain fragilities and you're better off knowing where your fragilities are? So we're going to give you some concepts that will help, and we'll just start with understanding a little bit more about fragility. The reason fragility is important, of course, is you've got more scope to make decisions that have some uncertainty about the outcome if you're less fragile. Otherwise, you've got to work around your fragilities, become some decisions that you may take might just expose you more readily. So one of the ways to think about fragility is just to basically run through this checklist. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I've spent a little bit of time on it already. So concentrated decision-making in the hands of a few, difficulty adjusting to environmental changes, and you can look at the history of that of your organization, over-reliance on poor processes where mistakes are introduced so they simply don't scale or they simply are non-adaptive, insufficient barriers of redundancy, a system that's so complex and undocumented that no one understands it, and then a whole series of bottlenecks. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I will point out that to help you understand and develop hypotheses as to what might happen, which is going to be very important for the decision-making theory we put before you, it's useful to consider value driver trees. Now, if you've been listening in, you'll know we're big fans of value driver trees at Bevington because they're great thinking tools, even if you can't put a number on absolutely everything. If you have an objective on the left-hand side and it's profit here, EBIT, it doesn't have to be EBIT, it can be a social outcome. You look at the drivers and you figure out which driver you can actually change. The other thing you can do with the value driver tree is run a range of scenarios, economic scenarios, to know where you're fragile. So for example, at the top box, it says if there's a 10% increase in price, that'll increase revenue by only 5%, but decrease customers by 20%. So it lets you know where your room to move might be and where you might get a particular bad outcome. So there's actually a fragility there, in that a price increase isn't really an option if you're going to lose a number of customers. Now, often there's a time difference, which is one of the problems. You might be fine for this reporting season, but you'll start to get the customer losses in the next one. So I'll just point out the value driver trees are useful before we start. And there's some concepts for making decisions under uncertainty. So we now know what uncertainty and risk is as defined by Bevington, but actually by a lot of really good thinkers, with very, very good arguments to make that case. And you understand fragility. So they're important background concepts to get the decision-making part. Now, the Amazon leader talks about this, Bezos talks about this, which is different types of decisions. And there's type 1 decision. We'll call it a locked path, and then there's an open path. And I'll start with the open path type 2. These are decisions which are effectively reversible. You can make them, but if you're wrong, you can back out and do something else. So they're changeable and reversible. And in fact, under these circumstances, as long as your measurement systems are in place, so you know that you've actually done something wrong and know that you've taken, let's say, a wrong turning, and you can do something about it, you're okay to do these. And it's very important to know the difference between that sort of decision and a bet the bank decision, which is the locked path type 1 decisions, where actually you can't back out, and you might actually be doing the organization enormous harm, and you might actually be putting pressure on a point of fragility, as we've talked about above. Fragile parts of the organization can often be found in particular places. So locked path type 1, which is, well, hard to back out of and can really hurt you, versus open path type 2, where you can back out of it, you should approach those decisions in different ways. So open path decisions give you the opportunity to take small, low-stake risks and actually learn. Learn by having a crack. Even if you make a mistake, you can do something about it, and the actual value you take is the lesson. And this relates to fragility. How it relates to fragility is that often making a low-risk mistake, you can actually become less fragile because you learn and enhance the system. And this is a stressor to the system, and this goes to Taleb's concept of anti-fragility, which is if you stress and rest, you can actually make the system stronger. So that's the human bodies. If you exercise and rest, you get stronger. Same with systems. So they are very related concepts, but essentially type 2 decisions can be made by individuals in small groups. They can be made faster, and the decision-making process needs to be very different from the bank decision, which needs to be slower, much more deliberative, much more contemplative, with lots of scenario modeling, narrative reasoning, which we'll come to, and the consideration of outlier risks, so things that are considered low probability but have a very high impact. So type 1, type 2 decisions, and you can imagine that a good organization would actually recognize the difference between the two, bet the bank versus not bet the bank, and potentially make those decisions differently. Now, we think those decisions should be made differently in decision models because they have different features. Now, one of the interesting things about some risks to be aware of, so often we think just about risk management rather than risk intelligence. And risk intelligence, it's a Bevington practice. We think a lot about how to apply these models, and the risk intelligence practice emerged out of the operating model work, where we had to design resilient organizations. Some risks are asymmetric. That means you take a risk and you know what the cost of it is, but you don't know what the upside is. These are good risks to actually take, particularly when you're engaged in type 2 activity. So there's something about teaching managers when they're making decisions to understand when they're faced with the situation that they know the cost, they've got a reasonable assumption, rational assumption about the reward, but it actually could be considerably bigger. These are the sorts of risks that you would consider putting in a portfolio of type 2 decisions. The only thing you got to watch is where you actually write about the potential downside. But Taleb talks about this about a lot. They're called asymmetric risk reward profile. And what you want to watch is the opposite, which is you don't know the cost, but you know the upside. So think of it as effectively a much more risky decision. And unfortunately, those type 1 decisions often have those features. So let's say a massive core system replacement, you want to actually do that. We know that it can be difficult to actually estimate the costs of doing that and estimate the risks of doing that. And your upside, though you can define, but it might even be lower. So that definitely should be a type 1 type situation. But the main point we want to make here really is there's a difference between type 1 and type 2. You can't make every decision on type 1. It's just too exhausting for the organization. So you need to distinguish between them and set up your operating model so that you're basically doing type 1 in a much more deliberative way than type 2. Now, we'll actually do much more depth on the actual technical details of making decisioning in the next webinar, but this is an essential foundation, and that's one of the key pieces that you need to be aware of. Okay, so educating managers on type 1 and type 2 decisions and being clear about when you apply the techniques of type 1 and type 2 decisions is an important precursor to organizations making really good decisions under uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty being it's so uncertain we really can't, with any confidence, put probability numbers on them. Okay. So what other pieces of advice do we have? So type 1, type 2, be clear about them. The other thing is to think about narrative. So now this comes from Kay and King, very, very eminent economists who actually critique the use of probability in certain economic contexts where it's really unjustified. In essence, it's a subjective probability. And he says, well, rather than ask what's the probability of something, he says it's better to try and understand the situation, or they say, and ask the question, what's going on here? What is happening in this context? So you've got an understanding of the situation. So if you understood what was happening in the GFC, that would put you in a better position to make decisions. You could even possibly anticipate what you think might happen with regard to, for example, US government response to prop up the banks. So if you ask what's going on here and why it's going on here, then you're in a better position to formulate a strategy. Now, I'll go to another writer called Rummelt, who wrote a book called about actually good strategy and bad strategy and titled accordingly. And he said that one of the features of really good strategy is it's got a kernel, which is clarity on what the problem is, a policy. Think of that as what people say, what we're going to do, our strategy and an action plan. That first piece of good strategy, what's the problem you're trying to solve, necessitates you answering the question, what's going on here? Now, that's different from saying, what's the probability of X, Y, and Z? It's actually saying, what's happening? Why is it happening? And that puts you in a much better position under uncertainty to make a good decision. And it is, in the research, very interesting to note how often this doesn't happen, the actual question of actually getting an understanding. So that's the next piece of advice. So ask what's going on here before you generate some hypotheses. Once you've got some idea of that, scenario modeling is a fantastic way to think about your strategy or make a decision. The fundamental idea in scenario modeling is that you run a number of possible scenarios, things that might happen from here. And what you're looking for is strategies or decisions that effectively work in multiple scenarios or most of them. And you'll find that there are some strategies that help you and or at least don't hinder you in many or most of scenarios that emerge. That's the goal, and that's where your decision energy should go. And this emerged famously out of the Royal Dutch Shell Company in relation to a major oil shock. So they position themselves much better than others. Now, you can do scenario modeling at multiple levels. You can think of it at the economy level, at a society level, at an organization level, at a department level, at a team level, or a personal level. So you can say, under these circumstances, what might happen? And you can do that scenario modeling from a basis of understand what's going on here. And let's find a strategy that works. And your decision is, well, should I take that strategy or not? But you've now got a very robust hypothesis on which to make a decision. Okay. Now, uncertainty. You don't know really whether your decision's a good one or your strategy is a good one. So you still need to manage some risk. So a partner to your decision is the risk management that might go with it. And this is particularly the case if it's a type 1 irreversible decision or very hard to reverse from decision. So this is where redundancy comes in. Now, you can have diversity as redundancy. It is a form of redundancy. You can have basically different types of inputs so you make good decisions. You can have modular systems as redundancy. You can switch them out, switch them in. And then you can have what Roberts refers to as dual use redundancy. And essentially this is, you've got spare resources, you've got them doing a project at the moment, but you could stop the project and roll them in to help you in the meantime. That third way of doing things is particularly valuable, I think, because you can actually often deploy those resources very, very quickly. But the first two are valuable as well. So particularly think about those Type 1, make sure that you've got some redundancy in place, but it's useful generally. Okay. So I've introduced you to the concept of fragility. We've introduced you to the difference between risk and uncertainty. And radical uncertainty is really when the clouds are so thick, it's very, very difficult to peer into the future. And we've given you some advice on how to proceed, including type 1, type 2 decisions, including narrative structures, including an understanding of resilience and redundancy enough that you can actually put some strategies in place so that you have a backup plan in the event of an emergency, because you never really know, and you should be careful about being so overly confident that you don't give yourself an alternative route out of trouble, particularly if it's a very, very big decision. So let's go back to that case study where our Japanese mayor had a little bit of a decision to make, but also had to convince people what actually happened. So this was the situation. It's very, very expensive to build effectively a dam with a floodgate that would protect this little village. 3.6 billion yen, $66 million today for a village to build this particular piece of infrastructure. And people argued that, well, we don't know there's going to be another major earthquake that will lead to a tsunami. It's an unknowable number. We can't put a probability to it. There are, by the way, those who argue that we would. How was the decision made? Now, this is about deep, long-term decision making. And you won't be surprised that actually there was that major tsunami. And this is the one we all know about. So 14 years after Wamura passed away, and that's the mayor, we had a 9 in the Richter scale earthquake, 66-foot tsunami approached and hit Japan's northeastern coast. But the village of Fudai was significantly spared because it was the only village that had the foresight to build this wall. Now, this is an interesting feature of great decision making. It looks darned obvious in hindsight, doesn't it? But it didn't look obvious at the time. And this was someone who actually had the capacity for longer term thinking. And this is a great feature to finish on. There's much more we can say about decision making, and we will. That longer term decision making is very useful for organizations that want to be around for a long time, and a great feature of stewardship. Wamura never lived to see the benefits of this decision, but it was nonetheless a great decision. So there's a key point in our lessons. Wamura couldn't put a probability, but he did a narrative-based model. He said it's happened in the past. I think it could happen again. Can't tell you when, but let's build this thing. Long-term thinking, foresight, and he invested in redundancy and resilience over optimization. So, in other words, you can be very, very efficient, and that's a great thing to be. But what you actually want to do is often have something put aside in the event of an emergency. And he was prepared to take an initial hit to invest in future security. Okay, so let's think about how we apply some of those lessons to today. Now, those of you who follow us know that we're operating model designers, so we think about all the parts of the operating model and how they stick together. So it used to be that people would do a restructure and just do the structural bit. These days, a restructure without considering the operating model is often considered a high risk option because everything's connected. So structure is connected to role, connected to process, which is connected to metrics, which is connected to policy, which is connected to rewards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we thought about how would you think about, as organizational leaders, making the organization more resilient and making good decisions in this radical uncertainty that we now face. And we actually do think we're facing radical uncertainty. It's radical in that it's actually hard to even know what the possible outcomes are, let alone be able to put a number on them. So risk and resilience model. So define a framework that recognizes and assesses and adapts to risk based on the latest thinking and research, which incorporates fragilities, not just risks. It accepts that it can be hard to put a number on things and actually builds anti-fragility into the model so that even if you've missed the risks, you didn't consider it, your organization doesn't suffer outrageously. That should mean adopting principles for org design, training, risk systems, and so forth. You should prioritize leading indicators because they'll give you a better idea what's happening and they'll help you ask that important question for decision making: what is going on here? Or at least prompt you to ask the question on what's going on here. Allow you to do the diagnosis that, according to the strategist Rumelt, who's a very famous strategist in that particular specialty, effectively insists it's the first stage of good strategy. Your policy design should ensure that decision making is appropriate for your organization, including making sure that you're not over-reliant on a decision maker and have single points of failure, but have decision making in the right place at the right time. And there'll be more of that in the second part of this webinar series, where we talk about not just how you make decisions and what your decision making options are. Once you've got that question answered, and once you've done your scenario planning, effectively, we're going to talk about how you design the model for that. You can use automation and AI to help you. You've got to put that in because it's certainly changing the way we can think and model, and make sure you've got the right skills. So you're really designing roles and teams to facilitate agile organizations. And so agile organizational models which can adapt quickly are inherently less risky than models which can't adapt quickly in the face of radical uncertainty. They also make decisions in a very different way, and they are multidisciplinary decisions in many cases, the way agile modules are structured. They're often, therefore, more robust decisions because they consider more angles. So what's our recommendation? Well, balance risk, resource, and resilience, as Anthea Roberts recommends. A narrow focus on rewards without considering risk undermines resilience. But similarly, if you have a fragile organization, an organization that's not resilient, you need to be a little bit more careful. And I'd suggest you're certainly careful about those type 1 decisions. But it's important to distinguish between type 1 and type 2 decisions. One thing it's very important to say is that doing nothing, getting stuck and taking no action, is absolutely a poor thing to do in a rapidly changing environment. So you don't want to be managing risk so tightly that you do nothing. It's about managing the risk in the right way. And you might, for example, make a lot of fast-moving type 2 decisions, and that could save you in a situation where the ground is shifting underneath you. You can build anti-fragility into your structure and your operating model so that you actually distribute decision-making to where it's best made and allow different parts of the organization to respond most appropriately to their local conditions. So one of the challenges has often been, and still remains the case, that making decisions in head office often means that you don't have a good insight because you don't have the right measures to decisions on the ground. So sometimes you can create a decision-making model that makes up for that lack of transparency. Now, the opposite is also true. There are times when absolutely centralization of decision-making counts in order to get efficiencies. And in the next webinar, we'll talk a little bit about when the conditions arise for centralization versus decentralization, and how do you manage the risks that arise with centralization. And then make sure there's skin in the game for people. That's an important part, such that they're incentivized to do good decision making. And furthermore, they're incentivized to think longer term. Let's think about that food eye village. And they're incentivized to build their own decision making skills. And of course, it's a very, very good idea to train your leaders in decision making. It's often a skill that is learned as you go through without any structure or without any framework in which to apply your learnings. So that brings us to the end, and we're nearly bang on time. So as I said, this is the first part of a radical uncertainty series, and this one's on decision-making, risk, and uncertainty. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through to webinar@bevingtongroup.com. Even though we're approaching the holiday season, we will endeavor to answer them. I hope you found this useful. Watch out for the next one. We're going to deep dive into some of the technicalities of making a good decision now that you have the right framing on risk, uncertainty, fragility, and some of the overall stances that you can take to making good decisions. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.